He studies memory for a living, but the real twist is what we should forget. Today, Dr. Charan Ranganath is here to tell us how we can design our memory to make us feel happier. Welcome to Hack Your Happiness. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Charan Ranganath.
A lot of information is forgotten very quickly. We shouldn't even be asking, why am I so forgetful? It's really, why do I remember anything in the first place?
Professor Charan Ranganath.
Charan Ranganath.
Professor Charan Ranganath
is a neuroscientist.
He has studied the mechanisms in the brain,
specializing in human memory.
Can we rewire our brains to forget or maybe let go of bad memories?
You don't want to, but you want to be able to not experience the intense emotions that go with it. If you look back in your early childhood, you probably...
That is crazy.
What is one of the biggest myths about memories?
Remembering should be, which are just all not true.
Is there a connection between our memories and our happiness?
Absolutely. You might be remembering something as mundane as, riding your bike to school or something like that. But if you were in a bad mood, that is going to be a big part. We know two things about memory. One is...
I think everyone needs to know that. Welcome to Hack Your Happiness. Welcome, Dr. Ranganath.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Hack Your Happiness is a podcast designed to bring you the behind the scenes of what brings iconic individuals happiness, plus their life hacks.
I'm Mercedes.
And I'm Anastasia.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to learn from you today, all about memory and the brain and how all of that is connected. You're a successful and renowned doctor, author, professor. So how did you get here today, and what inspired you to study the science of memories?
Well, I was thinking about this when you sent me this question, and wanted to know I wanted to think about what's the best way to answer it, because I have an easy one and I have a more complicated one, but I'll try to go in between. So relevant to maybe your listeners or what you're doing, I would say that one thing that was really formative for me is I grew up kind of different from most people, both because my neighborhood was very kind of white where I grew up. And so I was very much stood out. And then on top of it, I grew up I have ADHD, and both those things made it very difficult to grow up where I did, when I did. I think now teenagers have different reasons for having difficulties growing up. But back then it was there were no resources or anything, nobody to really talk to. So when I went to college, I really kind of had this sense that there was something wrong with me. And that's what usually drives people into psychology. So I got into psychology, then I started to learn about that, there's just a lot of interesting aspects about the way the mind works. And I ended up going into clinical psychology. And when I was doing that in grad school, I just tested a lot of patients who had brain damage. And the number one thing that brought people in invariably was memory. They would say they have a memory problem, or their relatives would say they had memory problems. And most of the tests we were doing were these tests of memory. And then meanwhile, in the clinic, when I was seeing patients, the patients who would be coming in would be essentially wanting to process traumatic memories. So for instance, my first therapy patient, he had a driving phobia. And so what the treatment for phobias is pretty straightforward. You just expose people to little amounts of what they're afraid of, and you wait for them to just sort of become habituated and sort of calm down. And you keep doing this over and over again until the things they're afraid of become boring. And it worked with his driving phobia. And the interesting thing, though, was he didn't want to stop. He still wanted to process more stuff. And the real breakthrough came when he had this realization that his driving phobia started on this day that he was gay, and he came out of the closet and told his father. And his father did not react well to it. They had a big fight, and he got into this car accident on that day. And so processing that memory for him was really impactful. And, as a scientist, I can't look at that and say, well, he remembered it perfectly, or the way that memory affected him is what caused him to have the phobia per se. But it was important to him, right? And so all of these factors in the clinic started to really get me interested in how memory works. And brain imaging was becoming a real technology at the time. And so it became viable for me to actually look at people's brains while they remember. And I thought, this is the way to modernize medicine, is if we can actually develop an understanding of memory that's based on the brain. And that led me to jump ship from clinical and go into full-time research, and I haven't looked back.
That's amazing. That is so fascinating.
Yes, I love the fact that, understanding why we feel certain things, or are afraid of certain things, or maybe are drawn to other things, is because of a certain memory. And when we like your patient, go back and really dig deep, how powerful and empowering and impactful it is to really understand that. So
Absolutely.
I think that's very interesting.
It's so fascinating how powerful our past is.
Exactly. And so I think, the concept of memories itself is so fascinating. But on the topic of our mood and our happiness, is there a connection between our memories and our happiness?
Absolutely. In fact, just in general, there's a big connection between memory and emotion. So one of the most basic findings is that emotion is part of the tapestry of what gets woven into our memories, right? So you might be remembering something as mundane as, riding your bike to school or something like that. But if you were in a bad mood while you're riding your bike, that is going to be a big part of your mental state at the time. And so we know two things about memory. One is, if you get into these emotional states, you're going to be able to you will more easily remember events that were associated with those states. So if you were in a bad mood now, you'd find it really easy to remember that bike ride when you're in a bad mood. But what's more important is that when you're in a bad mood, it's easier to remember negative events from your life. And the act of doing so actually makes your mood worse in the process. But the flip is also true, that if you're in a happy mood, you're going to be more likely to remember positive memories. And recalling a positive memory improves people's moods and gets them into a better mood on average, right? So, and then there's also kind of an interesting bias where people tend to remember themselves and remember these past events a little bit more positively than they really were, which is kind of a funny thing.
That's so interesting. So, when we feel, I guess, upset, we're in a bad mood, and then we're thinking about, what happened, with my friends, and then we just have a bad memory from that, we kind of get into this downhill spiral.
Exactly.
And then we get more and more upset, and it kind of feeds into itself. I think that's interesting, the kind of, I guess, how it spirals one way or the other way.
But it's an upward spiral or a downward spiral, and in any kind of situation, I feel it's interesting because you can almost, if you can recognize that, maybe you can even do a bit of a reverse. Mm-hmm. If you're in a bad mood and you're starting to think about negative things, you can kind of recognize that and start thinking about maybe a more happy memory.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why gratitude practices can be so powerful. I actually I'm not very good at keeping up with things, but I started to do something like that, where I used to think, why do gratitude practice? Because if I think about, I'm thankful I don't have cancer, then I'm just going to start worrying that I could get cancer in the future, right? So, but instead I started thinking about, what's the smallest, tiniest happy thing I can think of that happened in the last 24 hours. A friend of mine wrote me out of the blue and it got me thinking about them, right? Something like that. But what happens is that invariably thinking of that one little happy thing makes it easier to remember other happy things. And then that makes it easier to remember other happy things. And then next thing you know, you just feel better and you realize there's a lot of great stuff that happened in the day that you were ready just to forget about. So I think it's like you said, it's something that you can really use to your advantage to kind of help regulate your moods and just give you a little bit more balance in your life.
Absolutely. And I want to ask, because you mentioned something about how when we are remembering something, we actually tend to, and we're in a positive state of mind, we tend to remember it more positively than it actually happened. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So what happens is that we don't replay the past. It might seem like when you remember something, it's like you're just playing this little movie in your head, right? But if you remember something that was a really great time, like, a date that you went on or something like that, you're not remembering the entire 4 hours or whatever that happened during that time. You remember just like little snippets, little bits and pieces. And so a lot of research has shown that, in fact, when we recall these events, we actually engage a lot of the same brain circuits that we use when we imagine things that haven't happened. And so the theory that a lot of memory researchers have is that, in fact, when we're remembering, we're actually imagining how the past could have been, that remembering is an active imagination. Now, it's not to say we completely make it up. I mean, we do remember bits and pieces, right? But then we come up with the story about it. And so here's where this becomes relevant to what you're talking about is if you're imagining something, you're going to put together a story based on what you believe. You're going to put it together based on the perspective that you have right now. And that's why I say that like memories are more like a painting than like a photograph, because yes, if you take a picture, there's a little bit of perspective too. But when if you're painting a picture, let's say, it's never going to be perfect to the source. It's always going to have some bits and pieces of what you're trying to paint. But it also has a lot of your perspective that's neither right nor wrong. And it's how you look at the world in the moment. And if you look at like great artists, what you see is they have these periods in their life where they're doing different kinds of things as they see a world in different perspectives. And I think that's really important for your listeners, because I think, especially in your younger years, you tend to think this is the only way you will ever see the world. And in fact, it's just totally not like that, right? So I can look at like this person I was dating in college, and I was devastated when she dumped me. And, I could remember only, negative things about that relationship from that point on. Then I could remember, looking back now, I realized I really dodged a bullet, and I'm really glad that didn't work out. And I can remember things a little bit differently now because I've got a different set of beliefs, a different perspective.
Wow, that's so crazy.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
I think what's really interesting about that is like if sometimes as teenagers or at any age, it's so easy to look back of when we were like kids or, not teenagers yet and be like, oh, I miss being a kid. It was so easy. Like everything was so fun. I was so carefree. But then if you think about it, I think that's like a very good example of what you were saying there of like, we just focus on the positive kind of storytelling of us when we were having a great time and not all the times when we felt like we had no control over our choices or who we could, be playing with because our parents couldn't drop us off. And like, I feel like we don't tend to focus on that. So kind of realizing that like, there's good and bad in everything. And so like that's another reason to be kind of thankful for the present, because in hindsight, we might also remember this as more of an optimistic time.
And I noticed that you were talking about the way that you were thinking back when you were a teenager compared to how you were thinking now as an adult. And do teens process memories differently than maybe adults or children would?
So in preparation for this interview, I started to dig into that literature. And there's very little known about the teenage years. It was actually kind of disturbing to me. There's a lot that's known about what's called late childhood, which is about 7 to 12 years old. And then gobs of stuff on, college age people, which would be like, 17 to 20, 22, sort of that range, but much less in between. So a lot of the work that is done on adolescence tends to focus more on cognitive, like things like executive function, the ability to regulate your attention, your ability to kind of hold rules in mind and so forth. And the common story there is that it's, adolescence, parts of your brain that are important for, parts of your brain that are important for memory and executive function tend to be still changing a lot during adolescence. And so the story tends to be one of like your brains are continuing to improve until you hit the age of 20. And then there's a period from 20 to 24 where your brain's optimal. And then after 24, it all goes downhill again, which of course is ridiculous, right? And so there's another school of thought that it's like different developmental stages. Your brain is tweaked a little bit differently to encourage you towards different kinds of things. So one thing I found was suggesting that people who are in their adolescent years are better at learning when there's rewards, when there's incentives to do it. And so, like, better than adults, actually. And so that was pretty interesting. And there's also the fact that you have this period of what's called developmental plasticity, where all over your brain, those circuits can change just remarkably. Like if you had damage to your brain when you were 13, you could recover from that much more easily than somebody who is like 25. Like the rest of your brain can reshape itself, rewire the circuitry to make up for what was lost, right? So there are some really big things that are happening during adolescence, which are not all like, it's not all just kind of like this negative stuff. And then there's a lot that we don't know about, things like the effects of puberty and so forth. One thing that really bothers me is we also don't know a whole lot about women's health relative to men's health throughout the lifespan. There's all sorts of factors like the effects of cycle, contraception, pregnancy. A friend of mine, Emily Jacobs at UCSB, is just starting to study this stuff now. And it's pretty exciting, but at the same time, it's also like, why haven't people been doing this before? I guess the short version is there tends to be some work suggesting that maybe what's going on is that also your sense of self, your sense of who you are, is still changing. And so adolescents have a harder time seeing themselves forward or backward in time. And that's pretty important for things like planning and making decisions. And sometimes if you can't necessarily see what 10 years from now will look like, it's hard to make a decision that's going to mean suffering in the short term if it's going to give you this benefit 10 years from now, right? Because it doesn't feel like you will be alive 10 years from now, or the person you'll be seems almost like it would be a stranger. So why would I do something for the stranger, right? And so that's kind of the interesting thing about the adolescent brain. But I really do feel like we don't know nearly enough about it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for looking into that. I think that's interesting that there's kind of like this gap of knowledge on that. But it is so fascinating to me, the fact that, you touched on that sometimes it's harder for us to make decisions as teenagers because of the fact that we don't know like who we are. Because I'm about to graduate high school, like in my last year of high school, and I think it's so interesting because I'm like, university, college, there's this whole like life ahead of you, but at the same time you've only ever known school and like school, and then there's like one semester, second semester, summer, and then it just like keeps repeating itself, and then for the first time you're kind of out of that loop for a lot of people. And I think that's interesting because it's like you've never experienced that version of life, but that's like how most of your life will be. And so I think it's kind of interesting how you mentioned that in terms of decision making, because I think that that's something a lot of like probably people listening are experiencing, like teens or their parents right now, because it's hard to look that far out when you haven't experienced it yet in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just think it's so fascinating on how the brain is changing so much during these years, because I think everyone always thinks, the childhood years are extremely developmental, and they absolutely are, and they're so important. But I think it's kind of overlooked almost how I thought it was just shocking on the brain damage if you had that at 13 compared to 25, that, at 13 you can recover almost fully compared to a 25-year-old, which is just crazy on how much is changing during that time.
Yeah. We all need more happiness in our life, and we also all need some good happy gift ideas. And we've got you covered with Mission's Small Bits of Happiness, a happiness wellness activity box Anastasia and I designed together. It's basically a game. You do a card a day to build happy habits, learn what brings happiness, and connect with kids, family, friends, or just learn more about yourself. So whether you're shopping for a teen, for a tween, a child, or your family, this is an incredible gift. Shop now, it's linked in the show notes.
Yeah, and it goes the reverse direction too, that like late adolescence, early adulthood is around the time that mental illness really kicks in. a lot of what we thought of as kind of adult disorders, when I train, people would think of ADHD as this like developmental disorder, as if somehow when you turn 18 it disappears, right? Which of course is crazy. And people used to think of disorders like schizophrenia like something that happens to young adults, right? But now we tend to think of a lot of disorders as neurodevelopmental, meaning that you're not just born with it, but at the same time, they're things that sort of evolve, and really adolescence is a critical period. So things like depression, anxiety disorders, they really start to kick in around the adolescent period. Bipolar disorders, another one. So especially late adolescence. And so that's a big part too of why I think that the adolescent period is so critical for brain development that I think people should know this, and especially some people, for instance, drug use during adolescence can be really bad for brain health later on and put you at risk for psychopathology. I'm not giving people the whole like say no to drugs speech or anything like that, but it's just one of those things that I think we tend to think of ourselves as being like resilient to this kind of stuff, but especially these teenage years are super important for brain development.
Yes, absolutely. It's important to realize it's not just like a lot of physical changes, but also a lot about, what's happening inside our brain. And I'd love for you to tell us, like, what do you think teens and their parents should know about brain health, or like how to best care for our brains?
It's I got so many things, but one thing I'll say is sleep is very, very important, and exercise is very, very important. And this is the same thing I tell people who are in their 60s or 70s, right? Except that when you're an adolescent, you can get a real head start. And I think it's super important because when people are, let's say 65, you can make like changes in your lifestyle to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease, but you're working against time because you've beaten up your brain a lot since then. So making sure you get enough sleep and enough exercise, as a memory researcher, I find is very boring advice because it has nothing to do with memory per se, but it really helps with brain function and with brain development. And it's really kind of annoying when I look at the way education is done and people's attitudes about education, that it's like, we're going to get teenagers up really early in a way that doesn't align with their biological sleep schedules. And we're going to see recess or something like that, or PE, as things that are just like this, like fluff, as opposed to super important for brain development.
Yes, totally. And I'm really curious, kind of shifting to the topic of memory. I've heard from your book that there are actually different kinds of memory, which I never actually knew that or thought about that before. So what are the different kinds?
Well, we know that, for instance, learning certain things, like learning skills, like let's say if you decided to take up the saxophone or something like that, or if you decided to learn snowboarding, those kinds of skills are learned through circuits that are different from the ones that help us remember events from our lives, for instance. So somebody could have brain damage and not remember a past event, but they could still learn how to do things. And so somebody could theoretically, like, essentially learn how to snowboard, but not remember having learned it. If you had severe amnesia, then you just get on, you think, wow, I'm naturally talented or something, which is kind of interesting, right? That you can get these differences. We also know that episodic memory, which is our ability to remember events, is different from semantic memory, which is your knowledge about things that have happened and so forth. And so there's actually some really cool work that's been done, speaking of the teenage years, on kids who had brain damage very early on. And so they lost that capability to form new episodic memories because they lost an area called the hippocampus. But it turned out that some of these kids managed to do really well in school, not as good as they would have done with the hippocampus. They had to work harder and work around it. But they were able to build up all of this incredible degree of knowledge, even though they would look at their lives as just a story they heard from someone. Like they couldn't remember their actual experiences. And so what it shows is that ability to learn general knowledge about the world is different enough that it can be acquired without having an ability to remember where and when you learned that information.
That is so crazy to me
Yeah.
that you can, forget how you learned to snowboard, but then you can still be good at snowboarding.
It's interesting how it's not the same, like,
Absolutely, but it's
circuits,
so
yeah.
intertwined, but yet it's kind of kept in different areas. That's
Yeah.
really astonishing. And I've heard that memory has evolved to help us survive and thrive. And one major takeaway that we've had from your research is that our brains are not meant to remember everything. Tell us more about this misconception and what are we wired to remember compared to what we're supposed to forget?
That's a great question. So, yeah, it's funny because I always tell people that I have a terrible memory, but knowing what I know as a memory researcher, it doesn't really make sense, right? If I had a terrible memory, I would have had a real tough time in school because I wouldn't have been able to learn, but in fact, I did fine. And so there's something about like the way we think of memory that we just expect it to be easy. It should be effortless and it should be totally complete, that we should just be able to remember everything as it happened. And that's not true really, because if you look at even the first studies of memory were done by a researcher named Ebbinghaus. And so he tried himself to memorize this stuff just absolutely perfectly. And within 2 hours had forgotten 40% of what he had originally learned. It was like as if that 40% he was starting from ground zero again, right? So a lot of information is forgotten very quickly. And if that's the norm, like if you think about the majority of the details of your experiences, that's going to be lost to you within about a day, right? And so that is why titled my book, Why We Remember, because it's like we shouldn't even be asking, why am I so forgetful? It's really, why do I remember anything in the first place if it's going to be so incomplete? And the analogy, which I wish I'd put this in my book, but I came up with it after doing a lot of podcasts, is that you can think of like the way the brain works in terms of keeping us alive, helping us survive and thrive, as you said, right? And so if you think about like if you're taking a trip, right? Let's say you're going on vacation or something, you're hopefully not going to pack everything you own, right? Some people might overpack a little, some people might underpack a little, but you're probably not going to bring that vase and the flowers and so forth. You're probably not going to bring that end table. If it's cold, you might bring a sweater, but if it's hot, you probably might not bring that sweater, right? So what you're doing is you're saying, what do I think I'll need in the future when I'm on this trip? And that's what you pack. And our brain is trying to figure out that same problem. What are the experiences that I need to pack into the future, pack for the future? And it's just dumping the rest, basically, right? So your brain is basically using memory as a way of packing for the journey of life.
wow.
Wow.
I like the
That's
analogy.
a really good metaphor.
Yes. I think it's interesting that you say that, like, why do we even remember? Like, why are those things that we do keep in our brain, like, why are they significant enough? And I think that's interesting that, like, our brain is literally, like, kind of looking out for what we need
Exactly,
in
kind
order
of
to
cutting
carry
and
on.
taking what it thinks we're going to need and what's going to help us and prove helpful in the future.
And so I have a question of, like, if we do the things like sleep and exercise and, read and do things that are good for our brain, does that help? Like, does that make our brain, like, I guess, more aware of the important things and then we can remember better? Or does that have an impact?
That's a good question. So doing the positive things like getting enough sleep, exercising, and avoiding the negative things like, for instance, chronic stress is terrible for memory. The more you can do those things, the more especially you'll see benefits in executive function, that ability to regulate your attention, right? And as you can see right now, that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have for adolescents is there's so many devices and, basically so many things out there trying to steal your attention and encouraging you to multitask and say, yeah, well, couldn't I just check email while I do this interview right now, for instance, or couldn't I check my social media feed or something like that? And so all of those distractions are going to eat away at you, because one of the interesting things that people have found is that if you're trying to do something, like let's say if you got a really boring homework assignment and you're trying to focus on it, it gets tiring after a while. It's tiring on your brain, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's no reason the brain would find doing like a calculus assignment to be any more tiring than reading your social media feed. There's nothing more intricate in what your brain is doing, except for the fact that one seems more rewarding to you than the other, right? And so what your brain is doing is kind of working out all these alternative things that you could be doing and weighing that opportunity cost, what you could be doing against what you are doing. And the more what you are doing feels like it's losing, you're going to actually feel more tired and you're going to have trouble focusing more, right? Sleep, what it does, and exercise and all of these things improves the performance of your prefrontal cortex, which is the brain area that allows you to say, yeah, I know there's an immediate satisfaction out of checking my social media feed, let's say, but it's not what is important to me in the long run. And I have to keep this long run thing in mind. Like I've got to, get good grades for my college applications or whatever it is, right?
Yes, totally.
Absolutely.
That kind of short-term gratification, instant gratification versus
Definitely.
long-term reward.
I know sometimes I battle with that in the evenings when I'm doing my chemistry homework.
Exactly.
It's like, I need to get through this, but it's not my favorite.
Yes, but I think this is interesting because there have been moments that you're just going about your daily life and then someone says something or you hear a certain song or smell a certain scent and it just brings you back. It unlocks a memory. I know that for me, it unlocks a memory that I didn't even remember having until that. And I'm like, wow, I don't think about that regularly. But now that my sister, brought it up, I can remember it perfectly. And so
how does that correlation work? How does our brain kind of attach onto a specific smell or, song or I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the features of episodic memory that's really unique is it allows us to remember something that happened at a certain point in time, right? Now that thing only happened maybe once, but it's something that we can go back to again and again. Now, we don't have a little calendar in our brain that says this is, September 15th and this is 4:05 p.m. this happened. So the way the brain tracks time is in terms of changes in what's called context. And so context is this kind of word that we use in memory research to describe basically everything. It's like the force, So it's the temperature that I have in the room right now. It's the smells in this room right now. It might be the music that I've been listening to. It might be my emotional state. It could be the fact that, it could be I'm hungry or thirsty or something, right? All of these factors go into what we would call context. And so if you later get a reminder of a particular context, then that allows you to unlock the memories that are associated with it, right? So if you look at the things that are the most powerful vehicles for memory, things like music, things like smells, for instance, or being in places, right? Those are factors that tend to be really important for a particular time in your life, right? So the music you listen to now might not be the same music you're listening to 5 years ago, I'm guessing, right? And so later on, when you're in your 30s, if you hear one of the songs that you're listening to now, it will it'll elicit what's called mental time travel, where it'll bring back a memory of something that was happening around the time that you were listening to these songs. And once you pull that up, you get more of that mental context back. And it's as if you're being pulled back to your teenage years again.
Mental time travel, I like that.
I like that a lot, and I think it's really interesting how it's again with that spiral. It's you have all of these memories, but you're not always able to pull them just by being oh, I want to think back onto that time. But even just thinking back and looking at, I don't know, at a photo or something, and then you're able to recall one memory, which then links it to another memory, which then kind of starts to unravel a lot more memories. And you know, a lot of the times these kinds of events can not only make us remember good things, but also like specific bad memories. Can we rewire our brains to kind of forget or maybe let go of some of these bad memories?
So I have a bunch of different answers to this, but what I'll say, the best one I think is you don't want to do that. And I say this with a lot of sensitivity to people who've experienced traumas, for instance, because I do have, you know, when I give speeches or talks to people in the community, 9 times out of 10 people will say that they have, like, they don't remember well enough. And one time you'll have people come up to me and say, I had some terrible experience happening. Help me forget this, right? And the thing is that you don't want to forget that it happened, but you want to be able to not experience the kind of intense emotions that go with it, right? You want to be able to look back at the past without it being radioactive. So our brains naturally are wired to hammer into memory the details of events that are emotionally vivid, arousing for us. So if you look back in your early childhood, you probably, the things that you do remember will be things that were like associated with some big emotion, something that was very exhilarating or something that was scary or something like that, you know, something that was really got you revved up in a certain way, right? And so traumatic experiences are associated with the release of all these chemicals in your brain that actually also seal in those, that can seal in these memories that are sometimes negative, right? And what we know from the research is that the brain circuits that help us remember kind of some of the details of what happened, that context stuff, are different than the brain circuits that give us that oomph to the emotion that we feel, right? That kind of like sense like your heart's racing, your eyes are dilating if you're remembering something scary, or that, you know, kind of intense emotion that goes with it. And that's a different set of brain circuits altogether. And so it's possible to effectively change the emotional response without necessarily losing the memory itself. And I think that's the goal. So there's some progress now being done, I think, with kind of intense trauma that results in PTSD, like some of the work that's being done with psychedelics is looking a little promising. But in terms of everybody's, you know, more the whole range of human existence, you know, everybody has negative memories, right? But one of the things that I learned from my clinical work is the importance of understanding that memory is this painting that you have based on your perspective. And you can completely change that perspective and look at things completely differently and change the way you feel about it, right? And I gave you the example of getting dumped by that person I was going out with, and then now looking back, thankful, completely thankful that that relationship went up in flames, you know, and actually another relationship I can think of that way too, right? I talk about in my book about a time that I had this like crazy like paddleboarding experience and almost drowned. And later on, it became a really funny story. And so we have these things, and I'm sure you've had these experiences in your life where you went through something and it seemed really terrible, like, you know, maybe like just some long car trip or something like that, where you and your sister fought like intensely or whatever it was, right? And it's like later on, you can look back at that in a completely different way. And so what I would really encourage people to think about is, you know, often you need someone else to help you with that, because social interactions are a very powerful way to change your memories, because just the act, I mean, research has shown this, that just the act of sharing a memory with someone else changes it. And then when you react to the memory that I just shared with you, that changes it yet again, right? And so I've seen this over and over in group therapy, for instance, where like people will have these memories for experiences that are associated with a lot of guilt or a lot of shame. They've never told anyone about it. And when they tell people, they get this response from them that's super supportive and reframing the whole thing completely. And now they can look at their experience in a totally different way, right? And it goes in reverse too. Like, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this where you have people who are in these very toxic friend groups and relationships where they'll take things that are mundane and then make it into some big, terrible thing, right? So I think you have to be careful for when things work in the opposite direction too, because there's no objective good or bad with many memories, and some that are obviously going to be worse than others. Even then, I've talked to people who've survived really terrible things, and they said, that showed me that I'm really resilient. That showed me that I'm a survivor, or I learned a lot from that incident that I'm not going to make those mistakes again. And so I think every negative memory can be a real learning experience.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's something that I want to kind of incorporate into my life. And I know there's been some situations where it's like if you have a bad memory or something bad happens, something stressful, scary, whatever it might be, like just taking a step back and thinking, okay, yes, I can acknowledge the fact that like this was not good, but what can I learn from it, or what have I gained from it? Because I think sometimes, like I know I've had friendships that have fallen apart and I'm just like really upset about it, but then 6 months down the road, you have a better friendship with a better person, and then it's like, okay, well, if that bad experience had never taken place, I never would have met this person that has brought so much happiness to me. And so like thinking about like, what have I gained or what can I learn from any given situation can also help us kind of think about and perceive those not so great memories as good
I also think I love how you keep talking about perspective, because I think perspective is so important, because a lot of the time we can get really caught up in our own perspective, and I think sharing that with other people is something that we don't often think about, because it's often like, oh, but this is like something I want to like keep to myself, or I feel really guilty about this, I don't want to share it, or like this just like triggers me, makes me angry, I don't want to share it. But it can really reframe it, because as soon as we let another person's perspective in, especially someone who we value their opinion and someone who we trust, it can really help us kind of also reframe our own perspective, because we're letting in their thoughts as well. And that kind of, it's like having two artists paint an image, not just one.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. And I mean, there's been so much, like we've talked to multiple like happiness experts, and they're like, socialization is such a key aspect of happiness. And so I think that's so interesting how memory is also correlated.
Absolutely.
And like how you can have better hindsight if you share that with someone and socialize in that kind of sense. And so as a little bit of a twist in the conversation, I know a lot of teens and parents listen to our podcast, and as teens, a lot of us need our memory to be sharp because we need to perform well on tests and exams, remembering the topics that we studied. So what would be your top study tips for teen brains?
Yeah, that's great. Well, we've already talked about a few, like getting enough sleep and exercise as being pretty critical and useful. Reducing chronic stress to the extent you can, anything you can do for better mental health, that's really good. And, we didn't talk about this before, but, the opposite is true too, that when people are having mental health challenges, that can be very detrimental to memory, right? So getting the support you need is super important. But there's also some concrete kind of tips that you can use. So for instance, one that I really emphasize in my book, I devoted a whole chapter to this, is really giving yourself a chance to struggle with what you're trying to memorize. And what I mean by that is if you read, let's say, the textbook over and over, you will, the research shows that people feel like they learn the stuff really well, but in fact, they don't retain that information nearly as well as if you test yourself on it. And so, and what's really cool, and we've found this in our own research, is that you can test yourself on something before you've even learned it. So for instance, if you're trying to learn some words for your Spanish class, you could see the Spanish word and then try to guess what the English translation is for it, and then see what the meaning of the word is. And it turns out that that's much better for learning and retaining the information about that word than if you had just gotten the right answer to begin with. And it's this really counterintuitive finding, but it has to do with the way our brains kind of rewire when we learn. Because essentially when you give your brain the chance to generate an answer, once you get that feedback, oh, that's not the right answer, the brain can rewire itself so that essentially it can not only learn the right answer, but it can also squash the neurons that might activate the wrong answer the next time around. And that's really the problem in memory, is that we often have things that are competing with each other. So sometimes you'll have something where you're on the test, and you're like, I know the answer to this, but I can't get it. And the reason is that there's all these other answers that are competing with it. And that's really bad in multiple choice tests, because often you see the wrong thing, and then that wrong thing makes it really hard to remember the right thing, right?
Absolutely. I'm definitely going to try that with French.
Yes, French class.
But I think it's a really great way to think about it, that like that initial struggle is good, because oftentimes we're trying to like stay away from that because we want to have a more pleasant experience studying.
Yeah.
But just knowing like it's okay to make our brain like work a little bit harder in this one instance. And then because of that, we're going to remember it so much better. And even if that is like, even just going into it, testing your brain, even though you have no idea what the answer actually is, I think that definitely is very powerful and really helpful for studying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just want to add on something to this, because you were mentioning parents too, and I think sometimes parents can actually reinforce negative habits here, because sometimes the assumption that parents and teachers and kids have is that school is learning should be easy, that you should be able to get things that are effortless, like memorize things effortlessly. And of course, that's just not true. I mean, the research has shown this, that learning and memorizing is hard. And especially if it's something that's not so interesting for you, right? So the reason I think that's important is because you could struggle to learn something and then just come out of it saying, well, I can't do this. I'm just terrible at math, or I'm terrible at science, or whatever it is, right? And that actually won't help you learn. That struggle is just bad, period, right? That's just negative thinking that's going to actually be bad for memory. So I think it's really important that people reframe the way they think about learning. And I really wish, I mean, it's kind of crazy if you think about it, right? You're in school all day. Have you ever taken a class in how to learn?
No.
I mean, isn't this nuts, right? It's like, it would be like if somebody was a doctor and they had never taken a class in medicine, right? It's like you really should be trained in terms of how to learn and what to expect and so forth. And so I really think that it's important for people to have the right expectations about what learning should be like.
100%. I think that's so true. Such a good thing to point out. Like, why do we not get taught straight up front, like, do this, maybe don't do that? And also, it's not supposed to just be a walk in the park all the time. Like, I know for me, I love history. I can, read a whole book and remember all the different aspects, or in social studies, in history class, I will remember everything. And then I go to math and I can't remember like how to do anything. And then I, for the longest time, have just struggled with like, oh, I'm so bad at math, and so it's just not my thing. But like after hearing you say that, I think it's important to realize that like it's not because you're not smart or because you are not good at, a certain topic. It's because sometimes if you're not interested in something, you might just have to push through that struggle a little bit more, because you're not as like inclined, and that like reward aspect that we were talking about isn't there as much.
Sleep is so important for our happiness and well-being, and Mercedes and I have been loving our new Manta sleep masks. This amazing eye mask is 100% blackout, built for side sleepers, and can be made to fit whatever head size you have. They are so great for sleeping, especially when the sun's coming out in the mornings, or if you're going to bed a little bit earlier. And they are perfect for travel.
They're also a really fantastic gift idea for the holiday season or just any occasion. Shop now and save 10% off your Manta sleep mask by using the link in our show notes.
I know a bit of a hot topic that Mercedes and I have been thinking about a little bit is about AI, because we know that it has become, readily used in a lot of different fields, especially by parents and teens. How do you think that using AI will impact our memories?
It's really hard to say in terms of like the fact that real, AI, the impact is so, we haven't had a whole lot of years to see what it will really be like now that it's really blossomed. But we can say like a few things, I think. And one thing that I think is that I have concerns about is that it will change us in ways that make us less creative and less imaginative. And what I mean by that is if you have like, I started to see this in my emails where like Gmail started to complete my emails for me. And, sometimes it was right. Sometimes it would complete it completely wrong. Sometimes it would complete it in a way that I wouldn't have completed it. And I say, well, that's good enough. And so what happens is at that moment where I say it's good enough, my brain's tweaking itself so that it'll seem a little bit better the next time around. The more we're exposed to certain things, the more likely those things that seem familiar will seem better, right? And so I think one thing that we really need to watch out for is as people start to get exposed more and more to AI generated speech and writing and so forth and music, that it's like it starts to sweep everybody into this kind of like ball of mediocrity where it's like everyone's kind of going for rather than the AI helping us be creative and helping us do things that are original and novel. It's like we just become more like this AI system that was trained on kind of the entire internet, right? And so I think that's like something that I feel like is potentially concerning. Of course, there are also other things like, learning skills, like learning how to write, learning how social interactions and so forth. Those things I think are potential threats too. I do think there's potential benefits. I think education could be really revolutionized by having AI do more to personalize education and personalize the delivery of education. I don't think it's a substitute for teachers, but I think if it was used responsibly, there's some real potential there. What I don't think just using AI will somehow rot your brain. And nor do I think you're going to blossom because you're using AI. I think it's just a tool, right? But, the way we interact with the tools affects us. And I think that's what people have to be mindful about.
I love that. Not letting it, create a new standard by, letting it help us be more creative, but not letting it kind of replace our own creativity.
Yeah. Oh, and one more thing too, which is AI systems even now are incredibly inaccurate. Like I actually have a student who I asked to do research on just pull up a bunch of papers on this topic very quickly. I said, it's fine if you use AI tools. And she did, but she had to go through all of them because about 1 in every 5 papers it pulled up didn't exist. Like it was actually pulling up citations for papers that didn't exist, right? And so the potential for spreading misinformation is absolutely huge with this. And so I think that is something that everyone needs to be really mindful about, is that more and more we're going to have to start being skeptical of the things that we see, because there's not really a whole lot of forces out there trying to make this stuff accurate.
Absolutely. I just think that's crazy because I was thinking about this earlier today, that it's like it has access to every website on the internet, but
You'd think
that
it would
doesn't
make that
mean
easier,
that every website is accurate. Like if you're using, if I'm looking at like for historical projects and stuff, I always go on like Britannica and different like websites that I know have accurate information. But again, online sources like ChatGPT or Gemini are using everything out there, not just Britannica or National Geographic.
And unlike humans, they don't have a way of saying, I'm not sure. They'll just give you the answer. Like it could be something that is totally, shady, or something that's like rock solid, and they won't know the difference because they're just designed to regurgitate this text, right?
Yes, I mean, I definitely think that people still have a big role to play, especially speaking of that research. Wow. And speaking of research, I've heard that you've done some research on curiosity, which has really struck me, and I guess I'm curious about it. So tell us more. How can we all be curious?
One of the coolest things that we discovered in our research was that curiosity engages a lot of the same brain systems that are engaged when we're trying to energize ourselves to get a reward, right? So that same kind of brain, not entirely the same, but many of the same brain circuits and chemicals that are released when you're like, I'm hungry, I got to make myself a sandwich or something, right? Will be released when you get a question that ignites your curiosity. And what's really cool about that is those chemicals that are released when you're in a state of curiosity can actually enhance memory. They make your brain a little bit more plastic in the moment. And we've shown that it can enhance your memory for things that you weren't even curious about, right? And so that's really cool. So how can you use that for your benefit? And I think in terms of your own lives, I think one thing to do is really to think about questions more than answers. And what I mean by that is there's often these like gaps between what we think we know and what we actually know. And if you can identify those gaps, that's what triggers your curiosity. And I think right now, again, we talked about this, that there's these kind of misconceptions that sometimes if there's something you don't know, that's bad, right? And so part of it is cultivating attitude of curiosity, that when there's something you don't know or something that's new or unfamiliar, rather than being scared of it, you become curious about it, right? I mean, that's a practice that you can get into. And you can also use this in different ways if you're communicating or if you're teaching, that it's way more important to ask people the question that ignites people's curiosity than it is to just give people the answer, right? And I'm sure for the best teachers you've had, they're actually ones that really get you asking questions, not so much telling you the facts in some clearer way than another teacher did, right?
Yes, totally. And I think that's so fascinating, kind of like the intersection between memory and curiosity and all that surrounds that. And I think this applies, like this concept of the importance and value of curiosity kind of applies to so many different aspects of life. Like it applies to our learning and to our memory, but I also feel like even to our own happiness and to our relationships with other people. Like if you're curious about a person, if you're curious about yourself, why you think this way, why you have that feeling when you listen to that song, I think there's so many different ways that we can use curiosity to like become better versions of ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's really powerful, and it's very cool to know how intertwined those all are.
And something I'm curious about is, what is one of the biggest myths about memories?
Well, that memories are supposed to be, I get, we've already talked about this a little bit, but that remembering should be easy, complete, and accurate, which are just all not true. And so I think that is the biggest myth, is that we're supposed to remember everything and we're supposed to remember it exactly as it happened.
Yes, definitely. That's something I definitely thought was true
Absolutely.
prior to all of this.
Yeah, this has
But
been an amazing
I'm very
conversation.
excited to know, that that's not true, and it's okay if you don't remember everything.
Exactly. Next time you guys get mad at me because I don't remember something accurately,
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, it's not my fault, it's just my memory.
Exactly. And so if there is a teen who's listening to this right now and is interested in someday becoming a researcher, what would be your starting advice for their first step?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, so first of all, I think that it's like if they're already thinking of being a researcher, that's great. But if you're not, if you take science classes and you find them to be boring, one thing to keep in mind is that the way science is taught is not at all the way science actually is, right? And so a lot of the cool part of science is not knowing and being able to pursue your curiosity. So science often gets communicated as, here's this fact, here's that fact. And obviously I do that in my book, but it's like the real excitement in science is not knowing things or changing your beliefs, where you thought something and then you did an experiment and the results told you something really different, right? So I would say that it's like, again, cultivate that curiosity, because that is a big, big part of, being a scientist. And another is, when you're doing science, one of the cool things is you get to come up with the problem. You create, I like to say that engineers solve problems and scientists create problems. And I like to create problems for other people and for myself. So that's, again, a really important thing, is exposing yourself to enough kinds of sources of information that you can start to ask interesting questions and see connections between things that people might not find. And yeah, get involved in research. A lot of people don't realize that it's like the moment you step into college, you can actually like volunteer in a lab. But the biggest thing is, don't do it just for the sake of getting into grad school or something like that. Grad school is not going to be for everyone, and you definitely won't get much out of your time in the lab because of if you're doing it just to get ahead. But really try to do it based on this curiosity. Just keep asking questions, and whatever people ask you to do in research, try to do something more. And because it's not about doing a job. It's really much more special than that.
I love that.
And I know a lot of teens who are really into this idea of being a researcher and discovering things or learning more about things they don't know. And so I think that's some really fantastic advice, and I'm definitely going to share that with them. Yeah,
definitely. And now a fun question. If you had a time machine, what memory would you go back and experience all over again?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, I'd probably say my first date with my now wife, who we've been married now. Oh, we met actually in 1990. So it's been crazy 35 years. Yeah, so that's one I would like to go back to for sure.
I love that. That's
wonderful.
So sweet.
Yes. And what is one piece of advice, I guess also kind of going back in time, what is one piece of advice you wish you could give to your teenage self?
Oh God, I would give so much advice. My teenage self was a mess. I would probably tell my teenage self that it's not all about you. When you are a teenager, you kind of tend to think, at least when I was a teenager, I'll speak for myself, I tended to think anything that happened, had this huge implication for me, and I was at the center of everything, and it just wasn't, and then I guess, sorry, I'll just cheat and give you two, which is also just remember that life has a really, if you play your cards right, life has a pretty good timeline ahead of you. And so whatever is happening now is not the end of everything. It's just part of this journey. And yeah, whatever you think is going to happen, whatever plans you make, life changes and takes you in weird directions. And often that turns out to be a good thing. I've had so many times where I would not be here right now if I'd gotten what I wanted when I wanted it. So many of the things that put me on this path, which I'm very grateful for in retrospect, were the result of my advisor leaving and going to a new university when I was in grad school, or not getting into this grad school or this undergrad university that I would have wanted to go to, or all of these things that you think of as this monumental, earth-shaking thing that's going to ruin your life can actually turn out to just send you in a different direction and open up a new opportunity. The advice I often give to my grad students is you can think of life a lot of ways like surfing, where it's you can't create a wave out of nowhere, but you can pick which one to ride, and sometimes things will come your way, sometimes they won't, but you can pick which direction you want to take at a given time.
I love that.
That's such good advice. And I really love what you said about, just having faith and believing in the fact that it will work out long term. And I think that's something that we kind of talked about, but a lot of teens don't have that kind of long-term mentality because it's hard to imagine life outside of the usual, routine that we've been in for basically our whole life. But just knowing that it won't be that way always, and it's good to be present, but it's also good to know that there is good ahead. And I think that's really terrific advice. So thank you. And what do you do every day that brings you a small bit of happiness?
I take my dog for a walk. That is it gives me a small bit of happiness. Sometimes she's really annoying on these walks.
Us too.
I get it, absolutely. And do you have a motivational quote that you love and remember, and if so, why?
Yeah, I do. Well, you mean one that I generate or one that other people have told me?
Whatever you like. Yeah.
Okay. The motivational quote that I tell all my students is that if you feel imposter syndrome, that's probably a sign that you're doing something interesting. like if you feel like totally confident in what you're doing, you're probably not challenging yourself in any way, shape, or form, right? So if you ever feel like you're an imposter and you don't belong doing what you're doing, that's probably a sign that you're doing something really cool that is, you're learning, and that's not going to be comfortable, but it also means that you're going to grow from it, right?
Totally. I think
I love
that's a
that.
really nice way of reframing the imposter syndrome, because so many times we think, if I feel uncomfortable, if I feel uncertain, if I feel like this quote
I'm in the wrong
imposter,
spot.
I'm in the wrong place. But knowing that like this actually is kind of like a tell that I am doing something really cool, or
And that you're growing.
Yeah, and I think sometimes growth is uncomfortable, right? And that's important to know as well. And yeah, this has been such an incredible
Absolutely
conversation. Where can
amazing.
our audience find you if they want to keep up and learn more about you?
Well, I have a website which hasn't been updated often enough, called charanranganath.com, but that does have like news and things like that and links to media. And so I got to make sure we put yours on there. And also I have an Instagram. People can follow me on the Memory Doc, THE Memory DOC, all one word. And if you really want to, you could follow my band, The Null, because I post some music stuff there too. And I have a LinkedIn and a Blue Sky where people can look me up as well.
Amazing. Thank you
Amazing.
so
Thank
much for
you.
joining us today and sharing all your incredible insights. We've both learned so much, and we're so grateful for this opportunity. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Hack Your Happiness, and thank you so much to Dr. Ranganath for joining us today.
I learned
Oh my gosh.
so much. I think that was an incredible episode. And Anastasia, what was your biggest takeaway?
My biggest takeaway is that memories are not 100% accurate, and oftentimes it's like a painting. It's like all about the perspective of the moment that you were in, and then you can kind of, once you're thinking about that memory, you're gonna think more about other memories that are kind of similar in that like tone, or like what you're doing, or like what you were upset about. But yeah, I thought that was so fascinating.
Yes.
How about you?
Me too. One of my biggest takeaways is the fact that we can actually rewire how we think of negative memories by thinking about them in a more positive way, and like considering the positive emotions or positive effects of those situations. I think that's so interesting, how much power we hold over just all our thoughts, all of our thinking.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this interview, we think you would love our talk with Dr. Wendy Troxel, a sleep expert. Dr. Troxel talks to us all about the effects of sleep on happiness, top hacks on what to do if you can't stop tossing and turning, and also she busts some really, really cool sleep myths.
Napping has become controversial, particularly in our society. We have a lot of beliefs about, people who nap are lazy, and so there's been a lot of sort of controversy around this, whereas there are other cultures that napping is a part of the culture.
You can listen to our conversation with Dr. Wendy Troxel now. It's linked in the show notes.
If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a 5-star review from wherever you're listening. It really helps us out. We really appreciate it, and it also helps other people know that this is a great podcast to tune into as well. See you next time.